Hey guys, in today's last video on Bleak Barrow, we're going to be covering chests, objective markers and an easy way to achieve object source lighting without an airbrush. My name's Josh and welcome to Riddles in the Paint Pot. To start things off today, we're going to be looking at these magical traps or frost runes from the token set. To get things started, we're going to need to get all the painting done for them except for that lighting effect. So we're going to follow the same rules that I did for those bases in the last episode, and we're going to give them a prime of Mechanica Standard Grey, followed by a heavy dry brush of Celestia Grey, a lighter dry brush of white, and finally a nice strong wash of Null Oil. Now one thing I did in these that I didn't quite like is I left the stonework a little bit too light. You'd get a much nicer effect from this if you darkened it down, so I would recommend a second coat of Null Oil when doing this. So for the object source lighting effects, we're going to be using some blending techniques using some very thin colours. We're going to work our way up through Vallejo Heavy Blue, to Magic Blue, to Electric Blue, to Glacier Blue, and finally to White. So I'm not going to lie, this is going to require a fair amount of patience. So what we're going to need to do is water the paints down. For each of these I'm doing 3 parts water to 1 part paint. And what essentially the technique is just to layer it up while the paint's wet and just put layer after layer on there. This is going to take multiple coats for each colour, so you're going to need to be very patient with it, and you need to wait till it's absolutely dry between coats. The methodology here is to just paint it on thicker and further away from the cracks, and then with each lighter colour we're working further and closer back to the cracks until we have this final lovely effect. Now you can see on here with the dark blue I'm doing it quite a distance away, just over a millimetre or so, and then when we're coming in with the magic blue we're going to do that one still quite a wide one but nowhere near as much. With each of these layers you're just wanting to start from the middle, get all of the recesses of the cracks painted, and then work your way out towards the edge of where you painted last. What you should be aiming for with this second blue layer is you want to be able to just see the other blue layer feathering out from the side of it, so that you've got that blended effect of the two tones working their way in. Now onto the electric blue. Yet again I'm just starting from the centre of all the cracks and working my way around, but on this one I'm not really painting much of the top surface of the stone. It's a little bit more than an edge highlight, but it's like a thin line all the way around the top of the crack. You need to remember while you're doing this that we're not completely covering the previous layer, we're only working up to it just to say up to an edge, so that you can see the 3 tones so far linking through. Since we're using such translucent paints, it's going to give this really nice blended effect even though we're not actually wet blending. So we've now switched on to the Glacier Blue, which is kind of like a bluey off-white. Now what we're going to be doing here is we're going to switch down to a more detailed brush because we don't want to make any mistakes, and we're going to be painting the centre first, the walls of the crack, and then just sort of an edge highlight around the sides of it. This is going to be the first layer of that intense glow. The other 3 colours we've done have created that off glow. Now we're working on the actual light source itself. Just getting that nice highlight around the rim of the cracks themselves. It really helps to do these one at a time so that you've got a reference, as it can get a bit lost of where the cracks are if you're doing them both at the same time. Now for the final touch, we're coming in with the white paint, just for that extra solid glow. Now you're only going to want to paint this in the very deepest recesses of the cracks. Try to just get it on the very floor of it, try to avoid getting it on the walls as best you can, and absolutely don't get any of it on the surface of the base itself. This is just going to provide that really strong centre glow. To do this I'm actually using a brush that essentially just has 1 bristle on it, just to be extra detailed. It's the Army Painter Psycho. Great brush for dotting eyes or, well, painting cracks. And there you go, that's it all done. We've ripped the band-aid off and gotten the hardest bit done first. So as you can see, this is a really lovely effect, and although it seems a bit daunting, it's really easy to do. You can even practice on a bit of spare plastic sprue, just carve some cracks in it and try and get this effect. Looks really good. Only thing I wish I'd done is darken the base more beforehand. So moving on to the chests, the first thing we're going to want to do is give them a nice base coat of a really dark brown. I'm using Vallejo Charred Brown here out of my airbrush, but they do it in a normal game colour paint, so you can brush it on as well. You're going to want to do this for all the chests and the trapdoor. So the next step is to dry brush all of the wooden areas with Xandri Dust from Games Workshop. Just a nice light one, you don't need to go too heavy. But what you can do here if you want to create some extra depth is do a stronger dry brush towards the middle of any panel sections and little to none towards the edge of the panel. When we wash this will really accentuate this and give it a real feeling of depth. Now we're going to move on to all the metal on the chests and trapdoors. For this I'm using a colour called Pig Iron from Formula P3, very similar to Lead Belcher from Games Workshop, and any dark gunmetal will do. If you're feeling very brave as well, you can try and do all the pins and nails that are sticking out, using a nice detailed brush and being very careful. If you do make any mistakes with that, just water down a little bit of charred brown and cover up anything that you've gotten a bit of metal onto the outside of. We'll be doing a wash layer next, which will also help with this. Now one thing to highlight here is that the chests aren't the same material. You can see these chests, these square chests, are a very dark wood, similar to most of the wood in Skyrim. But then you've got the master chest with the round top. Now they've got a much darker, almost mahogany wood, so we're going to differentiate that using washes. Starting with the lighter wood on the chests and the trapdoors, we're just going to use Agrax Earthshade from Games Workshop. Just slop this on nice and thick, and if you get anywhere that's pooling too much, just come in with a dry brush to soak it up with capillary action. You can see these coming together straight away. And that's the final step for those ones, they're done. Moving on to the master chest now, we're using Null Oil from Games Workshop. Give this a nice good cover, and then once it's absolutely dry, you want to do another layer of Null Oil just to really darken it all down. To finish off the master chests, what you're going to need to do now is lighten up all of these little beams and struts around the edges of it. I'm using some watered down Steel Legion Drab. I'm just painting that over the tops of them, leaving all the recesses as they are to create that depth and that contrast to the rest of the wood. Next I'm just coming in with Lead Belcher, painting all of the little studs and that metal ring on the front. So the last step here is to go over all of these lighter supports and all of the metal with Agrax Earthshade just as before. This will create a nice contrast with the other chests and also with the really dark centre parts. So with these traps I wanted to do something a little bit different. So after my prime of grey, I came in with a base coat of leather brown through my airbrush here, but they do it in a drop of bottle as well. I then dry brushed all the earth with Xandri Dust from Games Workshop, and I also used Xandri Dust to give a base coat to all of the skeleton's parts, as well as the very tops of those spikes. Wherever there's wood grain, that's where you want to not do Xandri Dust, but if you do get any on the grain, don't worry, we're going to cover it up in a moment. So now I came in with a base coat of the Charred Brown from Vallejo and painted this over all of the wood and the ropes. Just be very careful when you're doing this that you don't get any charred brown on the surface at the bottom or on the skeleton himself. If you do, just tidy it up with a little bit of Xandri Dust or leather brown. I then came back in with the Xandri Dust and did another dry brush, this time of all that brown wood that we did before, just like we did with the chests, focusing a bit more on the ropes than anything else. Then I came in with some bone white from Vallejo and dry brushed all of the bone parts as well as the very tops of the spikes. And to finish off, I came in with Sepia Wash from Games Workshop to wash the skeleton, trying to be as careful as I can not to get any onto that earth beneath. And once that was done and dry, I then finished it off with some Agrax Earthshade on all the earth parts and all the wooden stakes. Now the final group of things to paint are all of these objective maskers and puzzle parts. As you can see, they're all really dark stone or a dark muted irony colour, so very similar to the puzzle door from the first episode, so we'll be doing something very similar to that. I started off with a layer of gunmetal from Vallejo Air Colour. Now this is a really dark metal colour, so I wouldn't recommend using lead belcher for this. I would recommend a 50-50 lead belcher and black to get a similar sort of colour. You can of course just buy airbrush colours and brush them on. I do it occasionally as well. They're essentially just pre-thinned. I then came in with Vallejo heavy charcoal and painted all of the stone faces, such as this puzzle part here, this book stand thingy, and the top of this rotatey puzzly thing. I then came in with a dry brush over all of the areas left gunmetal. On this particular piece I gave a little bit more attention to the dry brush, to the serpenty thing in the middle, but everything else it's a very light dry brush, just gently drag your brush over. And now at a wash we're just coming in with some Nuln Oil from Games Workshop again and covering all of that stonework. For the rock sections that I've already painted on this piece here, it's just exactly the same as the first episode from Bleak Barrow, so check that one out if you want to learn how to get that lovely undertoned effect. And just be careful that nothing pulls too much when you're washing here. Now we're going to come in with a dry brush of Vallejo London Grey, just nice and gently over all of the bits that we painted heavy charcoal before, so just those dark grey bits, just to help them make them pop. Onto that book, we're going to start with a base coat of Xandri Dust, followed by a dry brush of Tyrant Skull from Games Workshop. Once that's dry, I'm going to use something called a Micron pen. You can get this pretty cheaply from most art shops or eBay. It's essentially just a paintbrush in the form of a pen, and we're going to use this for the writing. In particular, I'm using a sepia one for this, which is the only colour I would recommend, as black or brown can look far too dark. So all you want to do for this is draw any symbols you want to and any squiggly lines. It's always best to practice whatever you're going to do beforehand on a little piece of paper. They're very delicate and you can get some very fine detail with these things. So now you've got a bit of a decision here. Micron pens take a little bit of time to dry, but if you apply a wash on straight away, it'll make them look really faded like I did here, which is what I wanted to go for. If you don't want this effect, just wait a good 20 minutes or so, but always wait at least 5 minutes or you'll completely wash it off. We're using Reichland Flesh Shade here from Games Workshop to get this lovely effect. And then we'll finish off with a trim of Vallejo Heavy Red just around the edge of the book, to highlight the bindings. So for this very last step we're going to come in with some Vallejo Sick Green and cover all of these vines on this base here. Then we'll highlight it very quickly just on the topmost recesses with a bit of Vallejo Goblin Green, and when we paint all of the bases for these we'll do it exactly the same as those arcane traps at the start of the video, and these items will get a black wash all the same with the rest of that stone on the base. As always, our last step is to go over it with a matte varnish. I use AK Interactive Ultra Matte, which is the best you can buy. It can also be brushed on, but looks best out of an airbrush. Another benefit I haven't mentioned to varnishing is if you have any glossy areas from where you've washed or from your agrax, this will hide that completely and bring everything together, and it'll give everything the same finish. Highly recommended. You should varnish your minis. So that's everything finished, and that's everything for Bleak Barrow done now as well. Super happy with how all of these turned out. Looking really sharp there. I gave everything a black rim on the bases at the end just to make them stand out as objective markers, but you can skip this and just have them the same colour as the stone. If you want to use them as terrain, I'd probably recommend not putting most of these onto the bases and just gluing them straight to your terrain piece. It's fair to say that I'm going to be getting a lot of use out of all of this terrain for my Skyrim. I still haven't received my miniatures yet, so we're going to be waiting a bit on them, I'm afraid, but I will do painting tutorials when they arrive. In the meantime, I think I'm going to move on to a couple of other little bits and bobs, maybe some Age of Sigmar or some Lord of the Rings stuff to paint in the meantime, so I'll still be doing some tutorials while we wait. Well, this brings an end to our Bleak Falls Barrow painting series. Thanks for watching, guys, and don't forget to subscribe for more painting tutorials in the future.